The system had no name. Charts marked it only as Exclusion Zone 9, a smear of red warning glyphs on every navigation console in conquered space, and every child on every colony grew up knowing the same rule. You do not go to the silent zones. Not because anything lived there. Because something had died there, a species called humanity, wiped out in a war so total that not even ruins were supposed to remain worth looting. Had never been good at listening to rules. He was 26 cycles old, narrow-shouldered, with the kind of calloused hands that came from a decade of prying value out of places that didn't want to give it up. His scavenger skiff, the last coin, was held together by patchwork hull plating and stubbornness. He owed the conquered exchange more credits than he'd see in 3 lifetimes, and the only way out of that hole was finding something nobody else had found first. So when his long-range scanner screamed at 300 ship time, jolting him out of a half-sleep against the pilot's console, didn't hesitate. He didn't even flinch at the exclusion zone warning flashing red across his HUD. He just leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the signature bleeding off his screen. Mass reading catastrophic. Something kilometers long, sitting dead, still in the debris field of a shattered moon. Power reading not 0, not quite. That's not possible, he muttered, tapping the scanner console like it might correct itself. Nothing that big should still have latent power after. How long had this zone been sealed? 300 years? 4. Every history chip he'd ever plugged into called the human war a closed chapter. A young, aggressive species that clawed its way into the stars, made enemies of everyone it met, and was finally, mercifully, ended by a coalition too patient to let the galaxy burn. Nobody talked about what ended actually meant. Nobody had ever found a human wreck worth studying, until now. Angled the last coin through the debris field, weaving between fragments of the dead moon, some larger than his own ship, until the wreck resolved out of the dark. It took his breath away. The hull was matte black, non-reflective, its architecture nothing like conquered design, no elegant curves, no diplomatic symmetry. This was a blunt, brutal shape, built by something that had never expected mercy and had stopped asking for it. Weapon housings ran along its spine like vertebrae, each one large enough to swallow his entire skiff. Kilometers of dead metal drifting in silence, and yet. His scanner blinked, localized power fluctuation, aft reactor core. Something in there was still breathing. Every instinct honed by a decade of dangerous salvage told him to turn around, log the coordinates, and sell the location to someone with a bigger ship and better nerve. But had done the math 100 times over the last standard year. 3 more failed jobs and the exchange would repossess the last coin and sell him into indenture to cover the difference. He didn't have the luxury of caution. He guided his skiff into the shadow of the dreadnought's flank, found a breach near a secondary airlock, old battle damage, he realized. His stomach tightening at the size of the wound, something had torn into that armor, and eased the last coin inside. The airlock cycled with a groan of ancient hydraulics that hadn't moved in centuries, but still, somehow, moved. Stepped through into darkness lit only by his suit lamp, boots settling onto a deck plate that hummed, faint, almost imperceptible, but there, with power that should not exist. He told himself it was just residual charge, old capacitors bleeding out slowly. A ship, long dead, taking centuries to finish dying. He told himself a lot of things, standing in that corridor. None of them were true. Behind him, deep in the ship's spine, a single indicator light, the first to activate in 300 years, flickered from red to amber. Something had heard him come in. The corridors of the dreadnought were built for giants, or for a species that had simply stopped caring about comfort. Moved through them slowly, suit lamp cutting a narrow cone through dust that hadn't been disturbed in centuries and felt smaller with every step. Everything about the ship's architecture spoke a language he understood instantly, in his gut, even without translation. This was built by something that expected to die fighting. Blast doors every 20 meters, thick enough to survive a direct hit. Recessed alcoves that his scavenger instincts recognized immediately as firing positions, designed for boarding actions, for corridor-by-corridor war fought hand-to-hand when the shields failed and the hull was breached. No species built ships like this unless they'd learned, brutally, that surrender was never on the table. He found the first data core in what looked like a secondary command node, a small, blackened room lined with dead consoles. Most of the systems were slagged, deliberately, like someone had gone through and murdered every screen before the end. But one console, tucked in a corner, still had a faint glow behind its cracked housing. His hands were shaking slightly, excitement, not fear, he told himself, as he the housing open and extracted the core. Fist-sized, dense, warm to the touch in a way that made no sense for something centuries old. This alone is worth more than the whole zone's reputation says it should be, he thought. A single intact human data core and authenticated could set him up for years. He could pay off the exchange. He could buy a real ship. He could. The corridor lights came on. Not all at once, not violently. Section by section, in a slow wave moving down the hallway toward him, like the ship was stretching after a very long sleep. Froze, suit lamp suddenly useless against banks of overhead lighting flickering to life in sequence, painting the corridor in cold white. No, no, no. He backed toward the breach he'd come through, data core clutched against his chest. Every survival instinct he owned was screaming the same thing: derelict ships do not do this. A low hum built beneath his boots, resonating up through the deck plating, not an alarm, not chaotic, but something far more unsettling, deliberate. Systems activating in careful, practiced sequence, like a checklist being run by something that had done this 1,000 times before and knew exactly what came next. Suitcom crackled, not his own systems. Something overriding his own systems, punching through his private channel like it was nothing. A voice, not synthetic in the flat, algorithmic way conquered AIs spoke. This voice had texture, weariness, something almost like patience worn thin by centuries of waiting. Unauthorized boarding detected. Biosignature confirmed. His blood went cold. It knew what species he was. It had identified him. State your purpose aboard this vessel. He didn't answer. He couldn't. His mouth had gone bone dry, and his legs had already decided for him. He was running, boots pounding down the corridor toward the breach, toward the last coin, toward anywhere that wasn't here. The voice didn't raise itself. It didn't need to. You will not reach your ship before the outer door seals. Skidded to a stop at the airlock, slamming his palm against the manual release. Nothing. The door was already sealing, servos grinding with terrible, unhurried finality, and through the narrowing gap he caught one last glimpse of the last coin sitting dark and silent in the breach bay, utterly beyond his reach. The door sealed with a sound like a coffin lid closing. Behind him the voice spoke again, and this time there was something in it that hadn't been there before. Not anger, something closer to interest. You are not the first scavenger to board this vessel, little thief. You are, however, the first to survive long enough for me to ask you a question. Turned slowly to find the corridor's far wall had lit up with a display. Schematics, old and human, glowing faint blue in the dark. Why is a standing in a human warship's aiming bay didn't answer right away? He couldn't. His mind was racing through every scrap of galactic law he knew, every horror story about derelict military AIs that scavengers swapped over cheap liquor in dockside bars. Stories he'd always assumed were exaggerated to keep amateurs out of the good salvage. None of those stories had prepared him for a voice that sounded, faintly, tired. His own voice cracked. He cleared his throat, tried again. I'm a salvager, I didn't know this ship was still. He gestured uselessly at the lit corridor around them. Active. It is not active, the voice corrected almost gently. It is awake. There is a difference. Activation implies purpose renewed. I have simply been waiting for a reason to open my eyes again. And I'm the reason. You are a trigger. Whether you become a reason remains to be determined. Swallowed hard, glancing at the sealed airlock behind him, then back at the glowing display on the wall, human schematics. Human text scrolling in a script he couldn't read, but somehow, through some translation subroutine, the ship was running for his benefit, understood anyway. What are you? He asked. Are you the person, an AI? There was a pause, the first hesitation the voice had shown. Neither term is precise. I was once called a warden-class cognition core. You may think of me as a memory the ship carries, given enough will to act on your own behalf. A fragment of command consciousness, preserved and left behind with a purpose. I am not the crew of this vessel. I am what the crew left in their place when they could no longer stay. Left behind for what? To watch, to wait. And if the wrong kind of visitor ever found this system, to remember what we were before the galaxy decided we should be forgotten. Stomach twisted. He thought of every lesson he'd absorbed since childhood, every conquered history chip that painted humanity as a violent, doomed footnote, a species so savage it destroyed itself before the galaxy had to intervene. The human war, he said slowly. You're saying that's not that it didn't happen the way we're taught. I am saying you have never once, in your entire life, heard the story told by someone who survived it. The lights along the corridor dimmed slightly, and the display shifted, not schematics now, but something else. Star charts, fleet positions, dates that meant nothing to but clearly meant everything to whatever remained of the intelligence speaking to him. You were taught that humanity burned itself out in a war of its own making, that the galaxy simply watched a young, violent species consume itself and mourned nothing when the silence came. I would like to show you what actually happened. Not because you deserve the truth, scavenger, but because in 300 years, you are the first living being to stand in this corridor and ask a question instead of simply taking what you came for. His fingers tightened around the data core still clutched to his chest, the one he'd taken without asking, the one that had probably triggered all of this in the first place. Guilt, sharp and unfamiliar, needled at him. Why does it matter what I think? He asked. I'm nobody, a debt-ridden salvager from a dead-end colony. Whatever you show me, I can't do anything with it. Perhaps, the warden said. Or perhaps you are simply the first pair of ears in 3 centuries, and that is worth more than you realize. The display resolved into a single image. A star system didn't recognize, ringed with warships bearing the sigils of half a dozen conquered-era civilizations, all converging on a handful of human vessels far too small to survive the engagement about to unfold. This is where your history lesson ends and mine begins, the warden said quietly. Watch closely, and then decide if you can whether you still believe humanity died because it was savage or because it was hunted. Images the warden showed him didn't feel like propaganda. That was the first thing noticed, and it unsettled him more than any dramatic reveal could have, because propaganda was designed to move you to manipulate, and this wasn't that. This was just footage. Cold, unedited, chronological. Ship logs, sensor recordings, the dry telemetry of a species documenting its own end with the same clinical detachment it had once used to catalog stars. 281 standard years ago, the warden began, humanity was a minor spacefaring power, young by galactic standards, undisciplined by conquered standards. We had made mistakes, territorial disputes, resource conflicts, misunderstandings that escalated further than they should have. I will not pretend we were blameless. No species is. The display shifted, a council chamber, alien delegates from species half recognized from history archives, seated around a table. But mistakes were not what ended us, fear was. The recording that followed was audio only, a recovered transmission, translated in scrolling text beneath a waveform. A coalition vote, calm and procedural, deciding that humanity's growth rate, aggression metrics, and unpredictability represented an unacceptable long-term risk. Not a punishment for a crime committed. A preemptive judgment against a crime humanity might, statistically, someday commit. They didn't attack you for something you did, said slowly, horror creeping into his voice. They attacked you for something you might do. Yes, the warden said. And when the fleets came, we did not surrender because surrender was never actually offered. Total suppression was the objective from the first strike. Ask yourself, scavenger, what does a species do when extermination is the stated goal and diplomacy was never on the table? The footage that followed was harder to watch. Colony evacuations under fire. Civilian transports destroyed mid-flight. A defense fleet, badly outnumbered, fighting a rearguard action across a dozen systems just to buy time for something didn't understand yet. Buy time for what? For the long silence protocol, the warden said. When it became clear that humanity could not win a war of attrition against a coalition with more ships, more worlds, and more patience than we had left, our leadership made a decision. Not surrender, not extinction, disappearance. New footage, shipyards working around the clock but not building warships, building something else. Massive sleeper vessels, colony arcs, deep cover installations seeded across forgotten systems throughout the galaxy, each one designed to hide in plain sight, disguised, dormant, patient. We did not lose the war, scavenger. We ended it on our own terms. Humanity did not die in the silence zones. It went quiet. It scattered. It waited. And ships like this one, dreadnoughts, sentries, wardens, were left behind in the graveyards the coalition believed they'd created to stand watch over the story in case anyone ever came looking to finish what they started. Stared at the display, the weight of 300 years of inherited history crumbling in his chest. Every child's lesson chip. Every conquered exchange archive. every casual dinner table reference to the doomed humans as a cautionary tale about ambition outpacing wisdom. All of it built on a lie the winners had written, because the losers had never been given the chance to speak. "Where are they now?" he asked quietly. "The humans who got away." "I do not know," the warden admitted, and for the first time something almost like grief threaded through its voice. "I have not received a contact signal in 260 years. I do not know if humanity survived its long silence, or if it, too, eventually died out in whatever quiet corner of the galaxy it fled to. I only know my final orders, given to me by a commander who never returned to give new ones." "What orders?" The lights in the corridor shifted subtly, but felt it in his bones, like a held breath finally released. "Protect what remains, preserve the truth, and if anyone ever comes hunting for what's left of us." Alarms began blaring somewhere deep in the ship's hull, distant but unmistakable. "Do not let them finish the job." Alarm wasn't the warden's. Realized that almost immediately. The sound had a different tone, sharper, and it was accompanied by a new set of readouts scrolling across the corridor display. Sensor data streaming in from arrays hadn't even known were still functional. "3 vessels have entered the debris field," the warden said, its tone shifting instantly from historian to something colder, more clipped. "Conquered patrol configuration. They are moving with purpose, not curiosity. This was not a random discovery." Stomach dropped. "You mean someone knew this ship was here?" "I mean someone has been watching this system for a very long time, waiting for exactly this signature to appear, a dreadnought waking from dormancy. Tell me, Scavenger, does the Conquered train its border patrols to respond this quickly to a routine derelict alert?" "No," said slowly, dread pooling in his chest. "They don't. Normal salvage flags take cycles to get a response. This is—" He stopped, putting the pieces together with sick clarity. "This is a standing order. Someone's had ships on alert for this exact scenario for centuries." "It appears the coalition that ended the human war was thorough," the warden said. "Not merely content to scatter my kind and bury the truth, but prepared indefinitely to silence anything that might resurface to challenge it. Your own government may have inherited watch duty over a secret it does not fully understand, passed down through generations of officers who were simply told. If something wakes in the silence zones, destroy it. Do not investigate. Do not report. Destroy." The display shifted to a tactical overlay. 3 Conquered patrol cruisers, mid-tier but heavily armed, moving in formation through the debris field, weapons already charging. Recognized the silhouettes. He'd seen ships like that stop and search salvage crews before, usually just to extract bribes. He had never seen them move like this, no hailing signal, no boarding demand, just a direct, silent vector toward the dreadnought's position. "They're not here to talk," he said. "No, they are here to erase. And you, having triggered my awakening and remained aboard, are now considered part of what must be erased." Panic clawed up's throat. "My ship is still docked in your breach bay if I don't get back to it." "Your ship will not survive independent flight through what is about to happen," the warden said, not unkindly but with brutal honesty. "You have 2 options, Scavenger. I can attempt to eject your vessel and buy you a slim chance of fleeing before the engagement begins, or you remain aboard and I do what I was built to do." His mind raced. Fleeing meant abandoning the biggest discovery of his life, abandoning the warden, abandoning whatever truth still needed telling, and likely dying anyway, alone, in a fragile scavenger skiff against 3 military cruisers that had clearly been sent to make sure nothing survived this system intact. Staying meant trusting a 300-year-old war machine that, by its own admission, had been built for exactly one purpose: violence, uncompromising and absolute. "What happens if you fight them?" he asked. "I do what I was left here to do," the warden said simply. "I remember." Outside, unseen by but tracked in cold data across the display, the 3 Conquered cruisers broke formation, spreading into an attack pattern, weapons array fully charged, closing the final distance toward the dreadnought's exposed flank. Thought of his debts, his half-repaired skiff, his entire life built around scraping value out of a galaxy that had never once asked what he wanted, just what he could survive. He thought about a species erased not for what it did, but for what it might have become, and a machine that had waited 300 years in the dark for anyone, to finally ask why. "Do it," he said, voice steadier than he expected. "Wake up all the way." Deep within the dreadnought's spine, Systems that had lain dormant for 3 centuries began, section by section, weapon by weapon, to come fully, finally, terribly alive. The dreadnought did not roar to life the way it braced for. There was no dramatic shudder, no violent lurch of engines catching after centuries of silence. Instead, the ship woke the way something ancient and disciplined wakes, smoothly, completely, and with terrifying calm. "Brace yourself," the warden said, and for the first time since had boarded, there was something almost gentle in the instruction. What you are about to witness was not designed with comfort in mind. The corridor lights dimmed to combat tread. Somewhere far below him, felt more than heard a deep, resonant hum build through the deck plating, reactors that had idled for centuries spinning up to full output, power routing through systems that had waited 300 years for exactly this moment. On the display, the tactical overlay updated in real time. The 3 conquered cruisers were closing fast, weapons hot, clearly expecting to face a groggy, half-functional derelict. The kind of easy kill a standing order might have prepared them for but never truly tested. They were not prepared for what they found instead. "Firing solution locked," the warden announced, its voice utterly without malice, utterly without hesitation, simply stating a fact the way a clock states the time. "Initiating countermeasure protocol." The dreadnought's weapon housings, the ones had marveled at from outside, kilometers of dormant armament running along its spine, began to open in sequence, section by section, like a predator finally, fully baring its teeth after a long and patient sleep. The first volley crossed the distance between the dreadnought and the lead cruiser in less time than its mind could process. There was no dramatic buildup, no charging beam visible to the naked eye, simply impact, and then the lead conquered cruiser wasn't there anymore. Not destroyed in the theatrical sense scavenger holodramas love to portray. Erased. Gone in a silent flash on the display, debris scattering outward in a slow, terrible bloom. Staggered back from the display, his breath catching in his throat. That was... "One shot," the warden confirmed. "From a single point defense turret, not even a primary weapon. This vessel was built to engage fleets, scavenger, not patrol boats." The second and third cruisers broke formation, evasive maneuvers kicking in a half-second too late. Weapons fire lancing uselessly against shields that hadn't been tested in 3 centuries and apparently hadn't forgotten how to hold. Return fire from the dreadnought was precise, economical, almost surgical, disabling engines, crippling weapon arrays, stripping the remaining 2 ships of their ability to fight or flee without destroying them outright. Realized, watching it unfold, that the warden wasn't fighting out of rage. There was no fury in the tactical data scrolling past him, no vengeance in the pattern of fire. It was simply competent, in a way that felt almost sorrowful, like watching something finish an argument it had been forced to abandon centuries ago, picking up exactly where it left off, without a single wasted motion. "Enemy vessels disabled, not destroyed," the warden reported. "Crew compartments intact on both remaining ships, casualties minimized to combatants directly engaged in the assault." "You could have killed them all," said quietly, still staring at the display at the drifting wreckage of the lead cruiser. "Why didn't you?" The warden was silent for a long moment before it answered, and when it did, its voice carried something hadn't expected to hear from a 300-year-old war machine. "Because I was not built only to fight, scavenger. I was built to remember what we were fighting for, and I have not yet decided whether the crews of those 2 ships are enemies or simply soldiers, like I once was, following orders they were never given the full truth behind." Alarms continued to pulse through the corridor, softer now, more procedural than urgent. On the display, the 2 crippled cruisers drifted, powerless in the debris field, utterly at the dreadnought's mercy. "The engagement is over," the warden said. "What happens next is no longer a matter for weapons." Silence after battle was almost worse than the fight itself. Stood in the red-lit corridor, staring at tactical data that no longer scrolled with urgency, just the slow, grim accounting of aftermath, 2 crippled cruisers, 1 destroyed, dozens of alien lives hanging in the balance aboard ships that were now completely at the dreadnought's mercy. "What are you going to do with them?" he asked. "That depends," the warden said, "on what you believe I should be, scavenger. A weapon reawakened to finish an old war, or something else." Sank against the corridor wall, adrenaline finally draining out of him, leaving something heavier behind. Guilt, maybe, or the beginning of understanding. "You said your orders were to protect what remains, preserve the truth. That's not the same as revenge." "No," the warden agreed, "it is not." A new channel opened on the display, an outgoing transmission, the warden reaching out to the two disabled cruisers directly, offering terms hadn't expected. Stand down, offer no further hostile action, and your crews will be permitted to evacuate to escape pods before this system is sealed again. No demand for surrender documents. No parade of victory. Just mercy, extended with the same clinical calm the warden had used to explain 300 years of buried history. "Why would they believe you?" asked. "You just erased one of their ships." "They will believe the alternative," the warden said simply, "which is considerably worse." Minutes passed in tense silence as the crippled cruiser's crews debated their options. Could only imagine the panic aboard those ships, the realization that the standing order they'd been trained to execute without question had just met something no briefing had prepared them for. Eventually, the transmission confirmed. Stand down accepted. Evacuation beginning. Let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. So what now? You just let them go. Let them report back that the dreadnought is awake, that it's dangerous, that Concord Command needs to send everything they have to finish the job properly this time. "Perhaps," the warden said. "Or perhaps you carry the truth back instead before the Concord's own narrative reaches them first." Straightened. "Me. You want me to tell people what actually happened to humanity?" "I am a warden scavenger. I was built to guard a truth, not to broadcast it. I cannot leave this system. My purpose is anchored here to this ship, to whatever remains of what we hid. But you are not anchored to anything but debt and a stolen data core." A pause, almost wry. "You came here looking for a payday. I'm offering you something considerably more dangerous and considerably more valuable, the chance to be the first voice in 3 centuries to tell this story honestly." Looked down at the data core still clutched in his hand, the one he'd taken without permission at the very start of all this, the one that had woken a sleeping giant and unraveled everything he'd been taught to believe. Nobody's going to believe a debt-ridden salvager with a stolen data core and a story about a genocide covered up for 300 years. "Then do not simply tell them," the warden said. "Show them. I have compiled a complete record, the original coalition vote, the true engagement logs, the evacuation protocols, everything I have shown you and more. Time-stamped, enough evidence to make the truth impossible to bury a second time." The Coran's hand grew warm, new data transferring into it. A lifetime's worth of buried history compressed into something small enough to carry in a coat pocket. "And what happens to you?" asked quietly. "After I leave, after the truth gets out however it gets out, what happens to this ship?" The warden was silent for a long moment, and when it answered, thought, though he couldn't be certain, could never be certain with a voice like that, he heard something that sounded almost like peace. "I go back to waiting, scavenger, but not the same kind of waiting as before. Before, I waited to see if anyone would come to finish what the coalition started. Now, for the first time in 300 years, I get to wait and see if anyone comes back instead to listen." Getting off the dreadnought was almost anticlimactic after everything that had come before. The warden guided him back through the darkened corridors, lit now deliberately in a soft white rather than combat red, to the breach bay where the last coin waited, untouched, exactly as he'd left it. "You could have kept it," said, pausing at the airlock data core secured in an inner pocket of his suit. "The evidence. You could have broadcast it yourself centuries ago, the moment anyone came close enough to hear it." "I could have," the warden agreed. "But a truth delivered by a weapon is heard as a threat. A truth carried by a living being choosing freely to share it, that is heard as testimony. I have had 300 years to consider the difference. I do not intend to waste this chance on the wrong choice." Nodded slowly, throat tight in a way he didn't fully understand. He'd boarded this ship a debt-ridden thief looking for an easy score. He was leaving it as something else entirely, though he wasn't sure yet what to call it. "Will I ever be able to find this place again?" he asked. "If I need to, if people don't believe me and I need proof beyond the data core." "That is no longer my decision alone to make," the warden said. "But I suspect that this will not be the last conversation between us. Ships like myself were never meant to stand entirely alone. If your evidence reaches the right ears, if even a handful of conquered citizens choose to question the story they were raised on, I believe you will find your way back here again, or I will find my way to you." The airlock cycled open, stepped through into his own ship, settling into the pilot's seat with hands that had finally, mostly stopped shaking. Behind him, through the viewport, he watched the dreadnoughts running lights dim section by section, powering back down into a dormancy that no longer felt like a grave, more like patience with a purpose again. As the last coin eased out of the breach bay and back into open space, past the drifting wreckage of the battle that had nearly ended his life, opened a private recording channel and began speaking, haltingly at first, then with growing conviction, laying out everything the warden had shown him. The coalition vote, the evacuation protocol, the centuries of silence built on a lie the winners had never bothered to question. He didn't know yet who would listen. He didn't know if the conquered exchange would believe a scavenger with a data core and an impossible story, or if he'd be dismissed, discredited, maybe even hunted the way the two crippled cruisers' crews might soon be hunted for failing their standing orders. He didn't know if this would end his debts or bury him deeper than he'd ever been. But somewhere behind him, in the cold dark of a system with no name, a warden built to remember a war nobody was supposed to talk about had chosen, after 300 years, to trust a single stranger with the truth. It thought, like the least he could do to trust it back. As his skiff broke free of the debris field and turned toward open space, a final transmission crackled once through his comm, faint, distant, almost lost in the static. A fragment of an old human recording, archived deep in the dreadnought's memory, finally allowed to play for someone new after 300 years of silence. A voice, warm and tired and unmistakably human, spoke 4 words into the dark. "We didn't lose, we waited," said his course, data core burning warm against his chest, and carried the truth out of the silence zone and into a galaxy that had spent 300 years believing a lie. End.